The bullet tore through Kyle Ransom's shoulder, just as the sun reached its merciless peak over Porterville, California. And he knew with absolute certainty that he was going to die alone in the dust if he didn't find help within the hour. Blood soaked through his shirt, turning the faded blue fabric a dark, sticky crimson as he stumbled away from the botched bank robbery he tried to stop. His horse had bolted during the gunfight, leaving him to stagger through the outskirts of town on foot, each step sending white-hot pain radiating through his entire upper body. The year was 1882, and Porterville was still rough around the edges, a place where justice came swift and hard, but mercy was in shorter supply than water during a drought. Kyle had been riding through town when he'd heard the screams coming from the First National Bank. 3 masked men had been making their escape, and without thinking, he'd drawn his revolver and fired at them, hitting one in the leg. The return fire had caught him square in the shoulder, and by the time the sheriff and his deputies arrived, the robbers were gone and Kyle was bleeding out in the street. The lawmen had thanked him but moved on quickly to form a posse, leaving Kyle to find his own way to the doctor's office. Pride and stubbornness had kept him from calling after them for help. Now, as his vision began to blur and his legs threatened to give out, he wondered if that pride was going to be the death of him. He stumbled past a narrow alleyway between 2 weathered wooden buildings and nearly collapsed against a water trough. His reflection stared back at him from the murky water, a 24-year-old man with dark hair plastered to his forehead with sweat, gray eyes growing dimmer by the second, and a face that had seen too much hardship for someone his age. Kyle had been drifting from town to town for the past 3 years, taking odd jobs where he could find them, never staying long enough to put down roots. Porterville was supposed to be just another stop on an endless journey, but fate had other plans. The sound of running water caught his attention, and through his fading consciousness, he realized it was coming from somewhere beyond the buildings. Using the last of his strength, Kyle pushed himself forward, following the sound like a beacon. His boots dragged through the dirt as he rounded the corner of a small house with peeling white paint and a sagging porch. In the backyard, a young woman was hanging laundry on a line strung between 2 posts, humming softly to herself. She wore a simple calico dress with an apron tied around her waist, and her dark blonde hair was pulled back in a practical bun. Kyle opened his mouth to call out to her, but all that emerged was a strangled gasp. His legs finally gave out, and he collapsed forward, crashing into a wooden fence post with a sound that echoed through the quiet yard. The woman spun around, her green eyes going wide with shock as she saw him sprawled in the dirt, blood pooling beneath his shoulder. For a moment, she stood frozen, her hands clutching a damp sheet. Then her training kicked in, years of watching her father practice medicine before consumption had taken him 2 years prior. Wilhelmina Knox dropped the laundry and ran to Kyle's side, her practical nature overriding any fear or hesitation. She was 22 years old and had been living alone since her father's death, supporting herself by taking in washing and mending, occasionally helping the town's overworked doctor with difficult cases. "Stay with me," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the fog that was descending over Kyle's mind. She pressed her hands against his wound, applying pressure to slow the bleeding. "Can you hear me? I need you to stay conscious." Kyle tried to respond, but darkness was pulling at him from all sides. The last thing he registered before unconsciousness claimed him was the feeling of being lifted, of strong hands gripping him under his arms and dragging him toward the house. Wilhelmina was stronger than she looked, hardened by years of physical labor and necessity. She managed to get him through the back door and onto the kitchen table, her heart pounding but her hands steady as she began the work of saving his life. The bullet had gone clean through, which was a blessing. Wilhelmina worked quickly, heating water on the stove and gathering clean cloths, whiskey for disinfecting, and her father's old medical kit. She'd assisted with enough gunshot wounds to know what needed to be done, though her hands trembled slightly as she cut away Kyle's shirt and exposed the ragged entry and exit wounds. Blood still flowed steadily, and she knew she needed to work fast. She cleaned the wounds with whiskey, her movements practiced despite the circumstances. The man on her table was unconscious, which made her work easier in some ways, though she worried about how much blood he'd already lost. His face was pale beneath the dirt and sweat, and his breathing was shallow. Wilhelmina threaded a needle with practiced efficiency and began the delicate work of stitching the wounds closed, first the exit wound in his back, then the entry wound in his shoulder. Her stitches were small and neat, a testament to her skill and her determination to save this stranger's life. As she worked, she studied his face. He was handsome in a rugged way, with strong features and a jaw covered in several days' worth of stubble. His hands were calloused, the hands of a working man, and his clothes, though dusty and blood-soaked, were well made. Whoever he wasn't just another drifter passing through. There was something substantial about him, something that spoke of character and strength. By the time she finished bandaging his shoulder, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across her kitchen floor. Wilhelmina had managed to move Kyle from the table to her father's old bed in the small room off the kitchen. It had been empty for 2 years, but she'd kept it made up, unable to bring herself to dismantle the last physical reminder of her father's presence. Now, a stranger occupied it, his chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm of deep unconsciousness. She sat in a chair beside the bed, exhausted but too wound up to rest. Her apron was stained with his blood, and she realized her hands were shaking now that the immediate crisis had passed. What had she done? She'd taken in a wounded man without knowing anything about him. He could be an outlaw, a murderer, someone the law was hunting. But even as those thoughts crossed her mind, she dismissed them. She'd seen his face when he collapsed, seen the desperation and pain in his eyes. Whatever else he might be, he was a man who needed help, and she couldn't have turned him away any more than she could have stopped breathing. The night passed slowly. Wilhelmina dozed in the chair, jerking awake every time Kyle stirred or moaned. She checked his bandages regularly, relieved to see that the bleeding had stopped. His fever rose as expected, his body fighting the trauma and the threat of infection. She bathed his face and chest with cool water, murmuring soft words of comfort even though he couldn't hear her. There was something intimate about caring for him like this, something that made her acutely aware of how alone she'd been since her father died. Dawn was breaking when Kyle finally opened his eyes. For a long moment, he stared at the unfamiliar ceiling, trying to make sense of where he was and what had happened. Pain throbbed through his shoulder, sharp and insistent, bringing the memories flooding back. The gunfight, the blood, the desperate search for help. He turned his head slowly and found himself looking into the greenest eyes he'd ever seen. Wilhelmina leaned forward, relief washing over her features. "You are awake," she said softly. "How do you feel?" Kyle's throat was dry as sand. "Like I've been shot," he managed to rasp out. A small smile touched her lips. "That is because you have been. Here, drink this." She held a cup of water to his lips, supporting his head as he drank greedily. The water was cool and sweet, and Kyle felt a little bit of strength return to his limbs. "Where am I?" he asked when he drained the cup. "My home. You collapsed in my yard yesterday afternoon. I am Wilhelmina Knox." She set the cup aside and studied him with those remarkable eyes. "You lost a lot of blood, but the bullet went clean through. You are fortunate." "Fortunate," Kyle repeated, and then something like a laugh escaped him, though it hurt. "I suppose I am. Thank you for helping me, Miss Knox. I am Kyle Ransom, Mr. Ransom." She nodded formally, though there was warmth in her voice. "Can you tell me what happened?" "I heard there was trouble at the bank yesterday, but I did not see any of it," Kyle explained haltingly, telling her about the robbery and his impulsive decision to intervene. As he spoke, he watched her face, trying to gauge her reaction. Would she think him a fool for risking his life for a town that meant nothing to him? But her expression remained neutral, attentive but not judgmental. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You are either very brave or very foolish, Mr. Ransom." "Probably a bit of both," he admitted. "My mother always said I had more courage than sense." "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." She was. The past tense hung heavy in the air between them. Kyle didn't elaborate, and Wilhelmina didn't press. Instead, she rose from her chair and said, "You need rest and food. I will make you some broth. Do not try to move too much. Those stitches need time to heal." Over the next 3 days, Kyle drifted in and out of sleep, fighting the fever that had taken hold of his body. Wilhelmina tended him with patient efficiency, changing his bandages, spooning broth and water into him when he was coherent enough to swallow, bathing him with cool water when the fever raged highest. She spoke to him sometimes, soft words about nothing in particular, and Kyle found himself listening to her voice like it was an anchor keeping him tethered to the world of the living. On the 4th day, his fever broke. Kyle woke to find pale morning light filtering through the curtains, and his mind clearer than it had been since the shooting. His shoulder still throbbed with pain, but it was manageable now, no longer the all-consuming agony it had been. He tried to sit up and immediately regretted it, gasping as the movement pulled at his stitches. Wilhelmina appeared in the doorway as if summoned by his distress. "Easy," she said, hurrying to his side. "You are not ready to be moving around yet." She helped him settle back against the pillows, her hands gentle but firm. "How long have I been here?" Kyle asked. 4 days. Your fever broke last night. You are through the worst of it now, I think." She poured him a glass of water from the pitcher on the bedside table. "Are you hungry?" "Starving," he admitted, and was rewarded with a genuine smile that transformed her face from merely pretty to something approaching beautiful. "That is a good sign. I will make you something more substantial than broth." She returned 20 minutes later with a tray bearing scrambled eggs, toast, and coffee. Kyle's stomach growled at the sight of it, and he realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten a real meal. Wilhelmina helped him sit up, propping pillows behind him, and placed the tray across his lap. Her movements were practiced and confident, but he noticed the way her hands lingered just a moment longer than necessary when they brushed against his. "This smells incredible," Kyle said, digging into the eggs with enthusiasm. They were perfectly cooked, fluffy, and seasoned just right. The coffee was strong and hot, exactly what he needed. "You are a good cook, Miss Knox." "Wilhelmina," she corrected him. "After 4 days of nursing you through a fever, I think we are past formalities, Mr. Ransom." "Kyle," he said, matching her tone. "And thank you, Wilhelmina, for everything. I would be dead if you hadn't found me." She settled into the chair beside the bed, her hands folded in her lap. "I did what anyone would have done." "No," Kyle said firmly. "Most people would have called the sheriff and let him handle it. You took me in, a complete stranger, and saved my life. That is not something just anyone would do." Color rose in her cheeks and she looked away. "My father was a doctor." He taught me that we have a duty to help those in need, regardless of who they are or where they come from. Your father sounds like he was a good man. He was the best man I ever knew. Her voice was soft with grief that hadn't fully healed. He died 2 years ago. Consumption. I tried to nurse him through it, but in the end, there was nothing anyone could do. I am sorry, Kyle said, and meant it. He knew what it was like to lose family, to feel that hollow ache that never quite went away. They sat in comfortable silence while Kyle finished his breakfast. When he was done, Wilhelmina took the tray and said, "I need to change your bandages. The wounds are healing well, but I want to make sure there is no sign of infection." She worked with practiced efficiency, unwrapping the old bandages and examining the stitched wounds with a critical eye. Kyle watched her face as she worked, noting the concentration in her expression, the slight furrow between her brows. Being this close to her, he could see the faint freckles across her nose, could smell the lavender soap she used. It made him acutely aware of how long it had been since he'd been this close to a woman, since he'd allowed himself to feel anything beyond the day-to-day struggle of survival. "Everything looks good," Wilhelmina announced, applying fresh bandages with gentle hands. "No signs of infection. You are healing remarkably well." "Thanks to you," Kyle said. Their eyes met and something passed between them, something electric and unexpected. Wilhelmina looked away first, her cheeks flushing again. "You should rest more," she said, gathering up the soiled bandages. "Building your strength back will take time." But Kyle found himself not wanting her to leave. "Will you stay and talk with me for a while? I have been unconscious for 4 days. I would like some company." She hesitated, then nodded, settling back into her chair. "What would you like to talk about? Tell me about yourself, about Porterville, about how you ended up living alone in this house." So she did. Wilhelmina told him about growing up as the daughter of the town doctor, learning medicine at her father's side because he had no sons to pass his knowledge to. She told him about her mother, who had died giving birth to a stillborn baby when Wilhelmina was 12, leaving just her and her father. She described the years they'd spent together, the close bond they'd formed, the way he'd treated her as an equal despite the conventions of the time. "After he died, I thought about leaving Porterville," she admitted. "There is not much here for a single woman with no family. But this house holds all my memories of him. I could not bring myself to go." "So you stayed and made a life for yourself," Kyle said. "That takes courage or stubbornness." She smiled wryly. "I take in washing and mending, and sometimes Dr. Garrett calls on me when he has a difficult case. It is not much, but it is enough to keep me fed and housed." "It is more than that," Kyle said. "You are independent, self-sufficient. That is admirable." "What about you?" Wilhelmina asked, turning the conversation away from herself. "What brings a man like you to Porterville?" Kyle told her his story, though he kept some of the harder parts vague. He'd grown up on a ranch in Wyoming, the youngest of 3 sons. When he was 21, a band of rustlers had attacked the ranch, killing his parents and oldest brother. Kyle and his middle brother had survived, but the ranch was destroyed, and with it, everything they'd known. His brother had headed east to start over, but Kyle had gone west, drifting from town to town, unable to settle, always feeling like he was running from something he couldn't name. "I am sorry," Wilhelmina said softly when he finished. "That is a heavy burden to carry." "It gets lighter with time," Kyle said, though he wasn't sure that was entirely true. "But it changes you, makes it hard to put down roots, to trust that anything good will last." She nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Losing my parents taught me something similar. That life is fragile and uncertain, that you have to hold on to the good moments when they come because they might not come again." They talked through most of the morning, their conversation flowing easily from topic to topic. Kyle found himself opening up to her in ways he hadn't with anyone in years, drawn out by her genuine interest and the warmth in her eyes. Wilhelmina, for her part, found herself enjoying his company more than she'd enjoyed anyone's in a long time. There was something solid about Kyle Ransom, something trustworthy despite the hardness that life had carved into him. The days that followed fell into a comfortable pattern. Kyle grew stronger each day, progressing from lying in bed to sitting up for longer periods, then to standing and walking around the small bedroom with Wilhelmina's support. She continued to tend his wounds, and he continued to heal. They talked for hours, sharing stories and opinions, discovering common ground and enjoying their differences. Wilhelmina would bring her mending into his room and work while they talked, her needle flashing in and out of fabric while Kyle watched, fascinated by the skill in her hands. A week after the shooting, Kyle was strong enough to venture out of the bedroom. Wilhelmina helped him to the kitchen, settling him in a chair at the table while she prepared lunch. He watched her move around the small space with practiced efficiency, her movements graceful despite the worn apron and simple dress she wore. "You do not have to keep waiting on me," Kyle said, feeling guilty about all the time she'd spent caring for him. "I know I am keeping you from your work." "Nonsense," Wilhelmina said, stirring a pot on the stove. "You are healing. That is what matters. Besides, I have rather enjoyed having the company. You must get lonely living here by yourself." She was quiet for a moment, her back to him. "I do," she admitted finally. "This town has been good to me, but it is hard to be a single woman with no family. People are kind, but there is always a distance. I am neither wife nor daughter, and that makes me something of an oddity." "Their loss," Kyle said firmly. "You are remarkable, Wilhelmina Knox. Any man would be lucky to have you." She turned to face him, surprise and pleasure mingling in her expression. "That is kind of you to say. It is the truth." Their eyes met and held, and Kyle felt that electric current again, stronger this time. He wanted to say more, to tell her that he was beginning to feel things for her that went beyond gratitude, but the words stuck in his throat. What did he have to offer her? He was a drifter with nothing to his name but a horse somewhere in town and the clothes on his back. The moment was broken by a knock at the front door. Wilhelmina dried her hands on her apron and went to answer it, returning a moment later with Sheriff Tom Bradley, a grizzled man in his 50s with iron-gray hair and sharp blue eyes. "Mr. Ransom," the sheriff said, nodding at Kyle. "Good to see you on your feet. I have been meaning to stop by and check on you, see how you were recovering from your heroics." "I am on the mend, Sheriff, thanks to Miss Knox's excellent care." "That is good to hear." The sheriff accepted the cup of coffee Wilhelmina offered him and settled into a chair. "I wanted to thank you properly for what you did during that bank robbery. You hit one of the robbers in the leg, and that injury slowed them down enough that we were able to catch up with them 2 days later. They are in jail now, awaiting trial." "I am glad to hear it," Kyle said. "Did you recover the money, most of it?" They'd already spent some, but the bank got back the bulk of what was stolen. The sheriff took a sip of his coffee, studying Kyle over the rim of the cup. "There is a reward for information leading to their capture, $500. The bank president wants to give it to you." Kyle's eyes widened. $500 was a fortune, more money than he'd seen in years. "That is generous of him. You earned it. You could have been killed." The sheriff set down his cup. "What are your plans, Mr. Ransom? Will you be moving on once you are fully healed, or are you thinking of staying in Porterville?" It was the question Kyle had been avoiding asking himself. Before the shooting, he would have said he was leaving without hesitation. Drifting was what he did, never staying anywhere long enough to form attachments or obligations. But now, with Wilhelmina standing in the doorway watching him with those green eyes, he found himself hesitating. I have not decided yet, he said carefully. It will depend on a few things. The sheriff nodded, as if he understood more than Kyle was saying. Well, when you are ready, come by my office and I will get you that reward money, and if you decide to stick around, there might be some work available. We could use a man who is handy with a gun and has the courage to stand up when it counts. After the sheriff left, Wilhelmina served lunch, but the easy atmosphere from before had been replaced by something more tense, more uncertain. Kyle picked at his food, his mind turning over the sheriff's words and the choice that lay before him. You are thinking about leaving, Wilhelmina said finally, breaking the silence. Kyle looked up at her. I do not know what I am thinking. You are a drifter. It is what you do. I understand that. Her voice was calm, but he could hear the hurt underneath it. It is what I have been doing, Kyle corrected her. That does not mean it is what I want to keep doing. Then what do you want? It was a simple question, but it cut right to the heart of everything Kyle had been feeling since he'd woken up in her care. What did he want? For 3 years, he'd wanted nothing beyond the next town, the next job, the next mile of road. But now, looking at Wilhelmina across the table, he wanted something different. He wanted to stay. He wanted to know what it would feel like to have a home again, to have someone to come back to at the end of the day. He wanted her, but saying all of that felt too fast, too presumptuous. They'd known each other barely more than a week. He had no right to burden her with feelings she might not share. I want to figure that out, he said instead. And I think I need to be here in Porterville to do it. Something like hope flickered in her eyes. You are going to stay. For a while at least, long enough to properly heal, to repay you for everything you have done for me. You do not owe me anything, Kyle. I do, though. You saved my life. That is not a small thing. Wilhelmina was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that made Kyle's heart stop. Do you remember that first day when you collapsed in my yard, bits and pieces of it? Why? You were barely conscious, in and out of awareness. But at one point, while I was stitching your wounds, you opened your eyes and looked at me. Do you know what you said? Kyle shook his head. You said, I know you, and then you passed out again. She met his eyes across the table. I have been thinking about that, about what you might have meant. I do not remember saying that, Kyle admitted, but maybe some part of me recognized you. Recognized that you were someone important, someone who was going to change everything. Or maybe you were just delirious from blood loss, Wilhelmina said, but there was a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Maybe, Kyle agreed, returning her smile. But I would like to believe it was the first thing. The tension between them eased, replaced by something warmer, something that felt like the beginning of possibility. They finished their lunch, and afterward, Wilhelmina insisted that Kyle rest. He was still recovering after all, and pushing himself too hard could set back his healing. Kyle didn't argue, suddenly aware of how tired he was. The conversation with the sheriff and the emotional weight of the discussion with Wilhelmina had drained him more than he'd realized. He settled back into bed, but sleep didn't come easily. His mind kept turning over everything that had happened, trying to make sense of the feelings that were growing stronger with each day he spent in Wilhelmina's company. He told himself for 3 years that he didn't want or need anyone, that the solitary life of a drifter was enough. But Wilhelmina was making him question all of that, making him wonder if maybe he'd been running from connection rather than toward freedom. The sound of her moving around the house was oddly comforting. He could hear her in the kitchen, the clatter of dishes being washed, the creak of floorboards as she moved from room to room. Domestic sounds that spoke of routine and normalcy, things he'd been without for too long. Eventually, lulled by those sounds and his body's need for rest, Kyle drifted off to sleep. He woke to darkness and the sound of rain pattering against the window. For a moment, He was disoriented, unsure of where he was or what had woken him. Then his shoulder throbbed, reminding him of everything, and he relaxed back against the pillows. The house was quiet except for the rain. Wilhelmina must have gone to bed in her own room. Kyle lay there in the darkness, listening to the storm and thinking. The rain reminded him of something, a memory that had been tugging at the edges of his consciousness for days. Suddenly, it clicked into place, and he sat up abruptly, ignoring the protest from his shoulder. 3 months ago, he'd been riding through the mountains north of Porterville when he'd come across a stagecoach that had been attacked by bandits. The driver and guard were dead, and he'd found a young woman trapped beneath the overturned coach, her leg pinned and broken. He'd managed to free her and splint her leg, then carried her on his horse to the nearest town, which happened to be Porterville. He'd left her at the doctor's office and ridden away before anyone could ask him questions or offer him thanks. That woman had been Wilhelmina. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on his own injury and recovery that he hadn't put the pieces together, hadn't recognized her. But now, thinking back to that day, he could see her face clearly in his memory. The same green eyes, the same determined set to her jaw, even through the pain and shock. She'd been wearing different clothes, her hair had been down, and she'd been covered in dust and blood, but it was definitely her. She'd recognized him, though. That was why she'd taken him in without hesitation, why she'd been so determined to save his life. She'd been repaying a debt, evening the scales between them. Kyle lay back down, his mind reeling from this discovery. He remembered now what she'd said when he'd carried her to his horse that day, delirious with pain. "Thank you," she'd whispered. "I will repay this kindness. I swear it." He told her there was nothing to repay, that anyone would have done the same. Then he'd ridden away, not wanting the gratitude or the connection, still running from anything that might tie him down. And now, 3 months later, fate had brought him back to her door, wounded and vulnerable, and she'd kept her promise. The next morning, Kyle waited until after breakfast to bring it up. They were sitting in the kitchen, Wilhelmina darning socks while Kyle sipped coffee when he said, "I remembered something last night." She looked up from her work. "Oh, 3 months ago in the mountains. The stagecoach that was attacked. That was you, was it not?" Wilhelmina's hand stilled and a slow smile spread across her face. "I wondered when you would remember, or if you would. You recognized me from the beginning, the moment you collapsed in my yard. Even covered in blood and half dead, I knew you. You are the man who saved my life." She set aside her darning and met his eyes. "That is why I said what I did that first day when you were delirious. I told you we were even now, that you had saved me first. I do not remember you saying that. You were not conscious enough to remember much of anything. But I needed to say it, needed you to know that I was not just some good Samaritan helping a stranger. I was repaying a debt." Kyle shook his head. "You do not owe me anything, Wilhelmina. What I did that day was what any decent person would have done." "That is exactly what you told me then," she said with a soft laugh. "But you are wrong. Not everyone would have stopped. Not everyone would have spent hours freeing me from that wreckage, splinting my leg, carrying me to safety. You saved my life, Kyle Ransom. The least I could do was save yours in return. What happened after I left you at the doctor's office? Dr. Garrett set my leg. It was badly broken, and he said I was lucky it was a clean break, that it would heal properly with time. I spent 6 weeks unable to walk, hopping around on crutches. It was maddening." She smiled at the memory. "I kept asking about you, trying to find out who you were, where you had gone, but no one knew anything. You had disappeared like a ghost." "I did not want gratitude or attention," Kyle admitted. "I just wanted to help and move on. Well, the universe had other ideas." Wilhelmina picked up her darning again, her needle flashing in the morning light. "Here you are, 3 months later, and now I have had the chance to help you the way you helped me. So we are even, we are even." But even as she said it, Kyle knew that what was between them had gone far beyond evening scores or repaying debts. The connection he felt to her was real and growing stronger every day. He wondered if she felt it too, or if he was just a patient to her, someone she'd helped out of obligation and would soon send on his way. 2 weeks after the shooting, Kyle was healed enough to leave the house for short walks. His shoulder still ached, and he couldn't lift his left arm above his head yet, but the wounds had closed cleanly and there was no sign of infection. Wilhelmina insisted on accompanying him on his first venture outside, worried that he might overexert himself or reopen the wounds. They walked slowly through the quiet streets of Porterville, Kyle marveling at how good it felt to be outside, to feel the sun on his face and breathe fresh air. The town was small but prosperous, with a main street lined with shops and businesses, residential streets branching off on either side. People nodded to them as they passed, and Kyle noticed the speculative looks directed their way. Small towns thrived on gossip, and he imagined there had been plenty of talk about the wounded stranger staying at Wilhelmina Knox's house. "Let them talk," Wilhelmina said, as if reading his thoughts. "I stopped worrying about gossip a long time ago. Still, I do not want to damage your reputation. My reputation is that of a spinster who lives alone and does washing for a living. I do not think it can get much worse." She said it lightly, but Kyle heard the edge of pain beneath the words. "You are not a spinster. You are young and beautiful and talented. Any man in this town would be honored to court you." "And yet none have asked," Wilhelmina said. "I am too independent, too unconventional. I know medicine and I am not afraid to speak my mind." "Men do not like that in a woman, or so I have been told. Then they are fools." She glanced at him, something warm and uncertain in her expression. "You keep saying things like that, because they are true." Kyle stopped walking, turning to face her on the wooden sidewalk. "Wilhelmina, I need to tell you something." "What is it?" He took a breath, gathering his courage. "I am not good at this. I have spent the last 3 years avoiding connection, keeping myself apart from everyone, but you have changed something in me. Made me want things I thought I had given up on." "Kyle, let me finish," he said gently. "I know we have not known each other long. I know I have no right to say these things. But I would regret it for the rest of my life if I did not tell you that I am falling in love with you." Wilhelmina's eyes widened, her lips parting in surprise. For a long moment she said nothing, and Kyle felt his heart sink. He'd misread the situation, mistaken gratitude and care for something deeper. He was about to apologize, to take it back, when she reached out and took his hand. "You have every right," she said softly. "And you are not alone in feeling this way. I have been falling in love with you too, Kyle. Since that first day in the mountains, if I am honest with myself. You were so brave, so kind, asking nothing in return. And then when you came back into my life, wounded and vulnerable, I realized that I had been given a second chance, a chance to know you, to be near you." Kyle felt like his chest might burst. "Really, really?" She stepped closer, her hand still in his. "I did not think I would ever feel this way about anyone. I thought I was destined to be alone, to live out my days in that house with nothing but memories. But then you fell into my life, literally, and everything changed." He raised his free hand to cup her cheek, marveling at the softness of her skin. "What do we do now? I suppose you could court me properly," Wilhelmina said, a smile playing at her lips. "Take me to dinner, walk me home from church, all the things respectable people do. I would like that." Kyle leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to. She didn't. Their lips met in a kiss that was gentle at first, tentative, then deeper as the feelings they'd been holding back poured into it. Kyle wrapped his good arm around her waist, pulling her closer, and Wilhelmina's hands came up to rest on his chest. The world around them faded away. The town, the people, everything but the two of them and this perfect moment. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Kyle rested his forehead against hers. "I am not going anywhere," he said firmly. "Porterville is my home now if you will have me." "I will have you," Wilhelmina whispered, "for as long as you want to stay. Forever then." They walked back to her house hand in hand, both of them smiling like fools, not caring who saw or what anyone might say. The future stretched out before them, full of possibility and promise, and for the first time in 3 years, Kyle felt like he had found where he belonged. The next few weeks passed in a blur of happiness. Kyle went to the sheriff's office and collected his reward money, then used part of it to buy his horse back from the livery where it had been stabled since the shooting. The rest he saved, thinking ahead to the future he wanted to build with Wilhelmina. He also took the sheriff up on his offer of work, signing on as a deputy. The job paid well and gave him purpose, something he hadn't had in a long time. He moved out of Wilhelmina's house and into a room at the boarding house, despite her protests that he was welcome to stay. It was for propriety's sake, he insisted, and to show the town that his intentions toward her were honorable. They courted properly, with Kyle calling on her in the evenings, taking her to church on Sundays, accompanying her on walks through town. People soon grew accustomed to seeing them together, and the gossip shifted from scandalous to approving. The wounded cowboy and the lonely spinster had found each other, and Porterville, for all its rough edges, was romantic enough to appreciate a good love story. 3 months after Kyle had collapsed in her yard, he asked Wilhelmina to marry him. He did it in her kitchen, where it had all begun, getting down on one knee despite the twinge in his still healing shoulder. He'd bought a simple gold band with some of his reward money, nothing fancy but made with love. "Wilhelmina Knox," he said, looking up at her with all the love he felt shining in his eyes. "You saved my life in more ways than one. You gave me a reason to stop running, to believe that I could have a home again. Will you marry me?" Tears streamed down her face as she nodded. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Kyle, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger and stood, pulling her into his arms. They held each other for a long time, swaying slightly in the middle of her kitchen, both of them crying and laughing at the same time. It felt like the culmination of everything they'd been through, all the pain and loneliness and loss that had brought them to this moment. They were married a month later in the small church on Main Street. The whole town turned out for the wedding, genuinely happy for the couple who had found love in such unexpected circumstances. Wilhelmina wore a dress of cream-colored silk that she'd sewn herself, and Kyle wore his best suit, his dark hair slicked back and his face clean-shaven for the occasion. Sheriff Bradley stood as his best man, and the doctor's wife served as Wilhelmina's matron of honor. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. When the preacher asked if anyone objected to the union, the church was silent. And when he pronounced them husband and wife, Kyle kissed his bride with such tenderness that several of the women in attendance openly wept. They held a reception in the church hall, with food and music and dancing. Kyle discovered that his shoulder had healed well enough for him to dance, and he spun Wilhelmina around the floor while the town fiddler played and people clapped along. She was radiant, her face glowing with happiness, and Kyle felt a contentment settle over him that he'd never experienced before. This was what he'd been looking for without knowing it, this sense of belonging, of being part of something bigger than himself. As the sun set, and the reception began to wind down, Kyle and Wilhelmina slipped away to the house that was now theirs. Kyle had spent the past month fixing it up, repairing the sagging porch, painting the exterior, making it feel less like a monument to the past and more like a home for the future. He'd moved his few belongings in the day before, and now, as he carried Wilhelmina over the threshold, it truly felt like their home. That night, they came together as husband and wife, their lovemaking tender and passionate, a physical expression of everything they felt for each other. Kyle was careful with his still healing shoulder, and Wilhelmina was patient and loving, guiding him, showing him what she liked. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the bed that had once belonged to her father, but which was now theirs, talking softly about their dreams for the future. "I want children," Wilhelmina said, her head resting on Kyle's chest. "At least 3. A house full of noise and laughter and love." "I want that too," Kyle said, running his fingers through her hair. "I want to give them everything I did not have. Stability, security, parents who are there for them." "We will," Wilhelmina said confidently. "We will build a good life together, Kyle. I know we will." And they did. The first year of their marriage was full of adjustments and discoveries as they learned to live together, to navigate the small frustrations and larger joys of married life. Kyle thrived as a deputy, earning respect from the townspeople and proving himself to be reliable and brave. Wilhelmina continued her work helping Dr. Garrett, but she also threw herself into making their house a home, planting a garden, sewing curtains, filling the rooms with warmth and light. They had their first child 14 months after the wedding, a healthy baby boy they named Kenneth after Kyle's father. Kyle held his son for the first time with tears in his eyes, overwhelmed by the weight of responsibility and love that came with fatherhood. Wilhelmina, exhausted but glowing, watched her husband bond with their baby and felt her heart swell with gratitude for the life they'd built together. 2 years later, they had a daughter, whom they named Grace. She had her mother's green eyes and her father's dark hair, and she was the apple of Kyle's eye from the moment she was born. Watching him with their children, seeing the gentleness and patience he showed them, Wilhelmina fell in love with him all over again. This was the man who had collapsed in her yard 4 years ago, broken and bleeding, and look at him now. Strong, confident, loving, everything she'd hoped for and more. Their third child, another boy they named William, arrived when Kenneth was 5 and Grace was 3. The house was indeed full of noise and laughter, just as Wilhelmina had wanted. Kyle had been promoted to sheriff after Tom Bradley retired, a position that carried both prestige and responsibility. He took his duties seriously, but he never let work come before his family. Every evening he came home to his wife and children, and every Sunday they attended church together, a unit, a family in every sense of the word. As the years passed, Kyle and Wilhelmina's love only deepened. They had their disagreements, of course, moments of frustration or misunderstanding, but they always worked through them with honesty and respect. They never went to bed angry, and they never let a day pass without telling each other how much they cared. On their 10th anniversary, Kyle took Wilhelmina back to the spot where he'd first saved her, the mountain pass where the stagecoach had been attacked. They'd ridden out early that morning, leaving the children with a neighbor, needing some time alone together. Standing at the place where it had all begun, Kyle pulled Wilhelmina into his arms. "You ever wonder what would have happened if I had ridden past that day?" he asked. "If I had not stopped." "I try not to," Wilhelmina admitted. "The thought of not having you in my life is unbearable." "I think about it sometimes," Kyle said. "How close I came to missing you, to continuing on that empty path I was on. But fate had other plans. It brought us together once, then brought us together again when I needed you most. Now we are even, Wilhelmina said with a smile, echoing the words she'd said to him that first day in her kitchen. No, Kyle said, kissing her forehead. We are beyond even. We are beyond debt or obligation. We are just us together exactly where we are meant to be. They stayed on the mountain until sunset, talking and remembering, reaffirming their commitment to each other. As they rode back to Porterville, the lights of the town twinkling in the valley below, Kyle felt a peace that had nothing to do with the absence of conflict and everything to do with the presence of love. He had found his home, not in a place, but in a person, and that made all the difference. The years continued to pass, marked by milestones and memories. Kenneth grew into a strong, serious boy who wanted to follow in his father's footsteps and become a lawman. Grace was spirited and intelligent, with a love of books and learning that reminded Kyle of her mother. William was the baby, sweet-natured and affectionate, always ready with a hug or a smile. Kyle and Wilhelmina watched their children grow with a mixture of pride and nostalgia, marveling at how quickly time seemed to move. They added on to the house, building extra bedrooms and a larger kitchen, turning the modest dwelling into a proper family home. The garden that Wilhelmina had planted their first year together flourished, providing vegetables for their table and flowers for her to arrange in vases throughout the house. When Kenneth was 15, he asked his father about the scar on his shoulder, the one Kyle usually kept hidden beneath his shirt. They were out in the barn, tending to the horses, when the boy's curiosity finally got the better of him. "How did you get that, Pa?" he asked, gesturing to the puckered white lines that marked both the entry and exit wounds. Kyle paused in his work, considering how much to tell his son. Then he decided that Kenneth was old enough to hear the truth. "I got shot during a bank robbery," he said. "Right before I met your mother, actually. I tried to stop some thieves and one of them shot me." Kenneth's eyes widened. "That is how you met Ma, in a way." Kyle leaned against the stall door, remembering. "I collapsed in her yard, half dead from blood loss. She took me in and saved my life. Nursed me back to health even though I was a complete stranger. Why would she do that? Because 3 months earlier, I had saved her life when her stagecoach was attacked. She was repaying the favor." Kyle smiled at the memory, but it became more than that. "We fell in love while I was recovering, and the rest, as they say, is history. So if you had not been shot, you might never have married Ma. I like to think we would have found our way to each other eventually. But yes, getting shot certainly sped up the process." Kyle clapped his son on the shoulder. "Everything happens for a reason, Kenneth. Sometimes bad things lead to good things in ways you cannot predict." Kenneth absorbed this in silence, then said, "I want to be like you when I grow up, Pa, brave and strong, someone who helps people." "You are already like that," Kyle said, his voice rough with emotion. "And you are going to be even better. You have your mother's compassion along with whatever courage I might have passed on. That is a powerful combination." As Kenneth grew older, he did indeed follow his father into law enforcement, becoming a deputy in a neighboring town. Grace surprised everyone by deciding to study medicine, determined to follow in her grandfather's footsteps, even though it meant going against convention. Kyle and Wilhelmina supported her completely, proud of her determination and intelligence. William, the youngest, showed an aptitude for ranching and eventually bought some land outside Porterville, building a small but successful cattle operation. Watching their children establish their own lives and families, Kyle and Wilhelmina found themselves with time alone together again, the house quiet now that it was just the two of them. They didn't mind. They'd always enjoyed each other's company, and this new phase of life brought its own pleasures. They took long walks in the evenings, sat on the porch and watched the sun set, traveled to visit their children and grandchildren when they could. On their 25th anniversary, the whole family gathered in Porterville for a celebration. All 3 children came with their spouses and children, filling the house with the noise and chaos Kyle and Wilhelmina had once taken for granted. They had 8 grandchildren now, ranging in age from infant to 10 years old, and Kyle loved spoiling them in ways he'd never been able to spoil his own children. The celebration was held at the church hall, the same place where Kyle and Wilhelmina had held their wedding reception. The whole town turned out, eager to honor the couple who had become pillars of the community. Sheriff Ransom, as everyone called Kyle now, had kept Porterville safe for 2 decades, earning respect and admiration from all corners. And Wilhelmina, through her medical work and her kindness, had touched countless lives. Speeches were made, toasts were given, and when it was Kyle's turn to speak, he stood and pulled Wilhelmina to her feet beside him. 25 years ago, he began, his voice carrying through the hall, I was shot during a bank robbery. I thought I was going to die in the street, alone and unmourned. But I managed to stumble to a house on the edge of town, and I collapsed in the backyard. The woman who lived there found me and saved my life. She was repaying a favor because months earlier I had saved her life under similar circumstances. We joked that we were even, that the debt between us had been settled. He paused, looking down at Wilhelmina with all the love he felt shining in his eyes. But the truth is, we have never been even. Every day I spend with this woman, she gives me more than I could ever give back. More love, more support, more joy than I thought possible. She gave me a home when I was homeless, purpose when I was aimless, and a family when I thought I would die alone. So no, we are not even. And I hope we never are, because that would mean I would have to stop trying to show her how much I love her. The hall erupted in applause, and Wilhelmina, tears streaming down her face, kissed her husband in front of everyone. It was a perfect moment, the culmination of 25 years of love and partnership. The party continued late into the night, with music and dancing and enough food to feed twice the number of people present. Kyle danced with his wife, then with each of his daughters-in-law and his daughter, then with several of his granddaughters, who giggled as he spun them around the floor. Wilhelmina danced with her sons and sons-in-law, her face glowing with happiness. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, Kyle and Wilhelmina stood on the porch of the church hall, watching their family load into wagons and buggies. Kenneth lived close enough to walk home, and he stopped to embrace his parents before heading off with his wife and children. "You two are an inspiration," he said earnestly. "The kind of marriage I hope to have with Rebecca." "You already do," Kyle assured him. "You chose well, son." After everyone had gone, Kyle and Wilhelmina walked home through the quiet streets of Porterville, their hands clasped, moving slowly because their joints weren't what they used to be, but neither of them minded. They had all the time in the world. "That was a wonderful evening," Wilhelmina said, leaning into Kyle's side. "It was," he agreed. "Though I am exhausted, I am too old to dance that much." "Nonsense, you are only 49, that is not old. Tell that to my knees." But Kyle was smiling. "Did you see Grace? She looked so happy." "I think she is going to announce she is expecting again soon." "I thought the same thing. And did you notice William and Martha whispering together? I bet they are thinking about adding to their family too. We are going to be overrun with grandchildren at this rate. Is that a complaint?" Wilhelmina asked, raising an eyebrow, not even slightly. Kyle pulled her closer, kissing the top of her head. "I love our life, Wilhelmina. I love everything we have built together. There is not a single thing I would change, not even getting shot," she teased. especially not getting shot. Because that brought me to you." They reached their house, the one that had been just hers when they met, but which had become theirs in every sense of the word. The porch Kyle had repaired all those years ago was still solid, and the garden Wilhelmina had planted still bloomed every spring. Inside, the rooms held the accumulated memories of a quarter-century of marriage. Photographs on the mantel, furniture they'd bought together, a cradle in the corner that had rocked all three of their children and was now being borrowed by various grandchildren. That night, as they lay in bed together, Kyle held his wife close and thought about the journey that had brought them to this point. If someone had told him, 25 years ago, that he would find love, build a family, and spend decades in one place, he would have laughed in disbelief. He'd been so certain that his path was a solitary one, that he was destined to drift forever. But Wilhelmina had changed everything. She'd shown him that it was possible to heal, to trust, to build something lasting. "I love you," he whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," she whispered back. "Always have, always will." The years after their anniversary continued in much the same vein. Kyle eventually retired from being sheriff, passing the badge to a younger man he'd trained himself. He and Wilhelmina spent their days tending their garden, visiting their children and grandchildren, and simply enjoying each other's company. They grew old together, their bodies slowing down but their love remaining as strong as ever. When Kyle was 62, he had a health scare that reminded them both how precious and fragile life could be. He'd been working in the garden when his chest began to hurt, a crushing pain that drove him to his knees. Wilhelmina, who had been inside making lunch, heard him cry out and rushed to his side. She'd seen enough heart trouble in her years of medical work to know what was happening, and she managed to get him inside and comfortable while sending a neighbor to fetch the doctor. Kyle recovered, but the incident changed something in both of them. They became more aware of time passing, more determined to make the most of every day. They took a trip to Wyoming, visiting the land where Kyle had grown up, seeing his brother again for the first time in decades. They traveled to San Francisco, marveling at the modern city that had grown up on the coast. They went to see Grace at her medical practice, bursting with pride at what she'd accomplished. But mostly, they stayed in Porterville, surrounded by the people and places they loved. Their grandchildren grew up and started having children of their own, making Kyle and Wilhelmina great-grandparents. The family tree they'd started with their own marriage had branched and spread, encompassing dozens of people now. On their 50th anniversary, the family threw another huge celebration. Kyle was 74 now, his dark hair gone completely gray, his body bent with age but his eyes still bright with life and love. Wilhelmina was 72, her face lined with wrinkles but still beautiful to Kyle's eyes. They'd survived half a century together, through good times and bad, sickness and health, exactly as they'd promised all those years ago. The party was held at Kenneth's house, since it was the largest, and people came from all over California to attend. There were great-grandchildren running around who Kyle had never met before, distant cousins and in-laws who were part of the extended family network. But at the center of it all were Kyle and Wilhelmina, the foundation upon which this entire family had been built. When it came time for them to speak, Kyle stood slowly, using a cane to steady himself and address the crowd. 50 years ago, he began, his voice not as strong as it once was but still carrying conviction. I married the woman of my dreams. I thought then that I knew what love was, what it meant to commit your life to another person. But I was wrong. Or at least, I was only seeing a small part of the picture. He paused, looking at Wilhelmina, who sat beside him with tears already streaming down her face. Love is not just one moment, one feeling. It is 50 years of moments. It is raising children together and watching them grow and have children of their own. It is supporting each other through loss and celebrating together in joy. It is forgiving each other's mistakes and building on each other's strengths. It is choosing every single day to stay and work and love, even when it is hard, especially when it is hard. He reached down and took Wilhelmina's hand, pulling her gently to her feet beside him. "This woman saved my life twice," he said. "Once when she pulled a bullet out of my shoulder and stitched me back together, and again when she gave me a reason to live, a reason to stop running and start building. Everything good in my life, every moment of happiness I have experienced in the past 50 years, can be traced back to the day she found me bleeding in her backyard. So thank you, my love. Thank you for everything." The applause was deafening, and through the noise, Wilhelmina stood on her toes and kissed her husband, just as she had on their wedding day at their 25th anniversary and countless times in between. It was a kiss that said everything words couldn't, that spoke of 50 years of love and partnership, and a bond that death itself couldn't break. Kyle lived to be 79 years old. He died peacefully in his sleep one winter night, his hand clasped in Wilhelmina's, surrounded by his children. His last words, whispered to his wife as she lay beside him, were "Thank you for finding me." Wilhelmina mourned him deeply, as anyone would mourn the loss of their soulmate after more than 50 years of marriage. But she also celebrated the life they'd lived together, the family they'd created, the love that had sustained them through everything. She lived another 3 years, spending that time with her children and grandchildren, passing on stories about Kyle, making sure that future generations would know what kind of man he'd been. When she died at 82, she was buried next to Kyle in the Porterville Cemetery, under a simple headstone that read "Kyle and Wilhelmina Ransom, together forever." Their children made sure of that, honoring the love story that had shaped all their lives. And in the years that followed, whenever someone asked about the Ransom family and how they came to be such a fixture in Porterville, the story would be told. About the cowboy who got shot stopping a bank robbery and the woman who found him bleeding in her yard. About how he'd saved her life months before and how she'd saved his in return. About how they'd fallen in love during his recovery, married, raised a family, and built a legacy that lasted generations. It was a story of chance and fate, of courage and compassion, of two people who found each other when they needed it most and chose to build something beautiful together. It was a love story for the ages, set against the backdrop of the Wild West, and it became part of Porterville's history, passed down from parents to children, a reminder that even in the roughest times and places, love could flourish and endure. The house where it all began, the house where Kyle had collapsed and Wilhelmina had saved him, stood for many years after their deaths. It was passed down through the family, each generation adding their own touches but preserving the essential character of the place. The bedroom where Kyle had recovered, the kitchen where they'd first admitted their feelings for each other, the porch where they'd spent countless evenings watching the sun set, all of it was maintained as a tribute to the love that had started there. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, when the California sun was setting over Porterville and casting everything in golden light, people swore they could see two figures sitting on that porch. An old man and an old woman, their hands clasped, their heads bent together in conversation or quiet companionship. It was just a trick of the light, of course, shadows and wishful thinking. But it was a comforting thought nonetheless. The idea that Kyle and Wilhelmina's love was still there, still present, still watching over the family and the town they'd both loved so much. Their story lived on, told and retold, changing slightly with each telling but always keeping the essential truth at its core. That love could heal the deepest wounds, that kindness repaid could lead to happiness beyond measure, that two people who saved each other's lives could build something that lasted far beyond their own mortality. It was a story that gave hope to the lonely, courage to the afraid, and faith to those who had stopped believing in happy endings. In the end, Kyle and Wilhelmina Ransom's legacy was not just the family they'd created or the work they'd done in the community. It was the proof they'd provided that love, real and lasting love, was possible even in the harshest circumstances. That two broken people could find each other and become whole. That a wounded cowboy and a lonely woman could build a life together that would echo through generations. And that, perhaps, was the greatest gift they left behind. Not just a story, but a promise. A promise that love was worth fighting for, worth building on, worth cherishing through all the ups and downs of life. A promise that somewhere out there, for everyone, there was someone who would find them when they were bleeding, stitch them back together, and stay with them through everything that came after. Someone who would make them want to stop running and start living. Someone who would turn a chance encounter into a forever love. Kyle and Wilhelmina had found that in each other, and in doing so, they'd created something that would never truly die. A love story that became legend, a legend that became hope, and hope that sustained everyone who heard it, and believed that they too might find their own version of that perfect, imperfect, wholly human love. The sun continued to rise and set over Porterville, California. Seasons changed, years passed, and the town evolved and grew. But the story remained, constant as the mountains on the horizon, enduring as the love that had inspired it. And every time someone told it, every time they spoke of the cowboy who woke to find her nursing him, who heard her say, "Now we are even, you saved me first," the love between Kyle and Wilhelmina Ransom lived again, bright and beautiful and eternal.